Welcome, everybody. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to join us. I'll send a note into the chat as well. Okay. As people start coming in, I see lots of people trickling in. Thank you. I will just do some quick introductions. So thank you for taking the time on this Thursday to spend with us. I'll give you a sense of what to expect for the next hour before we go into the details of our discussion, starting with some housekeeping items. As usual, this webinar is recorded. It will be sent out to registrants, so don't worry about that. We will be covering key changes to v2.0 of the SBTi corporate net zero standard, an example to help visualize how to apply the standard, and then how this may impact your existing targets. We are planning to leave about 15 minutes at the end to address audience questions, so please do share any questions that you have through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to get to as many questions as we can, but we may need to follow up with you after our discussion. So we do encourage you to leave your questions non-anonymously to allow us to follow up with you if needed. So you know who's talking to you. I'll introduce myself really quickly. My name is Natalia Pascual. I'm an associate partner based in Agendi San Francisco office. I have over a decade of experience in consulting in climate and sustainability strategy, and I do serve as one of Agendi's SBTi certified experts. Helena Walsh is also another SBTi certified expert, and she's unfortunately unable to join us today, but is absolutely a resource for you after the discussion if you would like to reach out with someone directly, especially if you're based in the EU region. I'll quickly introduce Kyra as well, who's also on this call. Kyra serves as the engagement manager for North America at the Science Based Targets Initiative and supports the socialization, adoption, and evolution of the SBTi standards through targeted stakeholder engagement, partnership development, and market insights. So she's been very busy lately. Prior to joining the SBTi, Kyra served as a sustainability engagement manager at Nike, where she oversaw sustainability partnerships and contributed to the development of Nike's 2030 sustainability goals. So we have a lot of wealth of knowledge here. For those that are unfamiliar, I'll briefly introduce Agendi. We are a specialist climate and sustainability consulting firm serving large global organizations. We support clients across a variety of sustainability and climate offerings, including science-based target setting and decarbonization strategies. And we're pleased to be joined today by Kyra from the SBTi directly. So I will hand it over to her in a moment once I quickly go through the contents of today's session. So first, we'll have Kyra review the v2.0 updates with an applied example and highlight what's next for the SBTi. Then I will be talking through target implications based on what target milestone you may be at, tying back to if you were with us for the April webinar, tying back to those milestones. And then we'll end with some key takeaways before opening it up for Q&A. So with that, I'll ask Kyra to take over.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Natalia and the Agendi team for having me. We love being able to collaborate, especially with our SBTi certified experts. It's really a great opportunity. So thank you so much. If you're here today, I assume that you are probably familiar with the SBTi, but in case you aren't, we are a corporate climate action organization that enables companies and financial institutions to play their part in contributing to global climate goals. We do this by developing standards, tools, and guidance to support companies in setting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in line with what science says is needed to keep global heating below catastrophic levels. And importantly, we really want to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. Through our subsidiary, SBTi Services, companies can pursue third-party validation of the targets they've set to reassure stakeholders that targets are credible and in line with SBTi's robust requirements. The SBTi was founded in the run-up to the Paris Agreement by the organizations listed on the bottom of the slide. Since our founding over a decade ago, our impact and reach has grown beyond our expectations, with over 12,000 companies having set targets or commitments with the initiative since then. Next, please. To begin, I wanted to give you a refresher on why the SBTi pursued a major update to the corporate net zero standard to begin with. One, our governance procedures, which we've established since we've grown from this initiative to a more formalized standard setter, requires us to update our standards every 2 to 5 years. Part of the reason and rationale for that is reflected in Objective 1 here, to reflect the latest climate science. Updating the underlying pathways in line with updated scenarios from the IPCC and others. Apart from that, we also recognized and were told repeatedly and emphatically, probably from some of you on this call, that an evolution was necessary when it came to approaching the complexity of Scope 3 or value chain emissions. Next, we wanted to incorporate cycles of continuous improvement, adding more clarity for companies about target cycles and keeping targets up to date while transparently reporting on progress and challenges on the journey to net zero. And lastly, we wanted to improve the overall structure of the standard for clarity with the intention of enhancing interoperability with SBTi's suite of sector standards and with other standards and frameworks in the corporate climate ecosystem. Before we get into the main changes today, we get to look at one of my very favorite slides that I get to present. As you can see here, the final standard was not developed by the SBTi alone, but with contributions and feedback from thousands of stakeholders around the world. Across 2 public consultation periods, we received almost 1,800 responses, and an additional 320 companies participated in some phase of our pilot testing. We are especially grateful for the 100 experts who contributed their time and expertise across our 5 expert working groups dedicated to the standard. If you are one of the folks that contributed to this process in one way or another, thank you so much. Your contributions have truly been invaluable. Now that we've covered a bit of background and important information on the standard and kind of our initial objectives, let's jump into some of the content itself. Before we get into any of the substantial changes, which I'm not saying this is not one, it's important to note that the standard introduces company categorization. Categorization is designed to recognize that companies vary significantly in size, location, resources, and capacity, which can impact much of the target setting and implementation process. The standard offers 2 categories for companies, Category A and Category B, based on the thresholds you can see here. Criteria throughout the standard is applied based on this categorization, with some criteria applying to all companies and other criteria only applying to Category A, while remaining optional for Category B. It's important to keep this in mind as we dive into some of the details of the standard. Now, let's look first at some of the similarities between version 2 and version 1. If you're familiar with version 1, you will see that version 2 truly builds upon the strong foundation set by that previous version of the standard. And indeed, some elements are foundational to both standards, even if they may have evolved in version 2. First, the ambition of the standard continues to be grounded in reaching net zero by 2050. The specific methods and underlying pathways have been updated to take into account the latest climate science and geographical and sectoral context. Next, companies are still expected to report and set targets based on a physical inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. However, companies may use actions and market instruments not reflected in the physical inventory to implement targets. Third, absolute emission reduction targets can be set in all scopes. However, the standard strives to provide more options for target setting in response to feedback and learnings from thousands of companies setting and implementing targets with version 1. Next, direct decarbonization, meaning actions that target emissions reflected in the physical inventory, remain our priority. The standard is designed to guide companies towards pursuing real change in their operations and value chains, while recognizing that interim measures may need to be less direct as broader systems decarbonize. Last, we're moving towards a new 5-year target cycle. which we will see in more detail momentarily, that concludes with a robust end-of-cycle assessment of target progress. As I just mentioned, the standard introduces a new cycle of target setting, anchored by 5-year near-term targets, which are bookended by the target validation and a robust end-of-cycle assessment. However, there are steps that companies before the target validation. These are outlined in the first 2 chapters of the standard. And of course, there's the matter of actually implementing targets and reporting on target progress. So as you can see here, the standard consists of 6 overarching chapters that roughly align to the target setting cycle. The focus of today's session will largely be on the process and requirements for setting and implementing targets. So looking at some of the options and requirements outlined in chapters 2 through 5. But for more detailed information on any of the chapters or elements that we do not have time to address today, I encourage you to visit the SBTi's webpage on version 2. You can also connect with the Agendi team and some of our other SBTi certified experts. All right, so let's get into really setting and implementing targets with version 2. So assuming that a company has, they've secured the internal buy-in to set science-based targets, which that's an element of chapter 1. We're not covering that in detail today. But the first step in setting a target under version 2 would be to define organizational and operational boundaries, ensuring that all subsequent calculations and targets accurately reflect the company's structure and activities. All companies are required to complete a target base year assessment to support their initial target validation under version 2, and again for each subsequent target cycle. So for each new target cycle, a company is required to select the most recent year with comprehensive data as the target base year. This reflects changes in company structure and emissions over time and aligns with SBTi target setting methods that determine ambition based on a company's current emissions profile rather than a historical base year. It's important to note for companies that have existing targets, they've been using a historical base year, they can still communicate target progress in relation to that base year. However, target ambition for the near-term cycle is based on most recent year emissions. There are also some exclusions if the most recent year does not accurately reflect company activities, structure, et cetera. But those are detailed, in more detail in the standard and supporting resources. Next, companies must account and report a greenhouse gas inventory aligned with current greenhouse gas protocol standards and guidance, using the most recent and effective versions available. So without really opening up an entire separate topic, this includes the recent land sectors and removal standard for flag emissions and biogenic emissions and removals. The greenhouse gas protocol standards are evolving, we realize that, and we're attempting to maintain alignment with our ongoing updates by emphasizing that companies must separately account for and report actions and market instruments not currently reflected in the physical inventory. Finally, all companies must report their total consumption of electricity, as well as calculate and report the percentage of total electricity consumption that meets the threshold to be considered low carbon. This is defined in the standard. After a company has set and determined their base year, that will inform how they determine what target types are most suitable for their unique structure and activities. In scope 1, companies can set an absolute emissions reduction target. These are targets that reduce emissions on a linear trajectory. Or, if applicable, they can set an emissions intensity target for sector activities that are eligible to use a sectoral decarbonization approach. These are outlined in SBTi sector standards and guidance. Or, what's listed on this slide is a new target type introduced in version 2. These are called asset transition targets, which allow companies to reduce emissions from major assets aligned to either an overall carbon budget or by specific milestones leading to the net zero target year. This new target type was introduced to recognize that the timelines for replacing, decommissioning, or retrofitting significant assets may not always align neatly with near-term target cycles and measuring year-over-year progress. In scope 2, Companies can choose to set an absolute emissions reduction target or a low carbon electricity alignment target. If setting an alignment target, companies increase the percentage of low carbon electricity used, contracted, or matched on a linear trajectory in line with an eligible net zero pathway. For scope 3, companies can choose to set an overarching absolute emissions reduction target. They can set an overarching supplier and/or customer alignment target. That is an evolution of our prior supplier engagement target. There's a slight change in the term that we're using. Or they can choose to set targets at the individual category and activity level. One thing that I did not note previously in the target base year assessment, but the target boundary for scope 3, companies are required to include any significant category of emissions. These are defined as representing 5% or more of significant scope 3 or of your scope 3 emissions. So this is categories 1 through 14. There are some exclusions as well listed in the standard. And of course, SBTi or the Agendi team can provide you more details on exactly how scope 3 target boundary is assessed. So with that out of the way, the category and activity level targets are intended to drive supplier, customer, and product performance towards compatibility with a net zero economy. So new target types worth noting here include volume alignment. This would be a company growing the share of purchased commodities or transport that are lower carbon or net zero aligned. We're also introducing a product use alignment target, which would be a target to grow the share of sold products with lower carbon or net zero aligned use phases. And lastly, a product end of life alignment target. This would be a target to grow the share of products designed with circular end of life solutions. Next, please. Once a company has selected the target setting methods most suited to their operations and value chain and have successfully validated their science-based target, now they turn to the most challenging task of all, implementation. Recognizing that companies face all kinds of barriers on the journey to decarbonize, and that there is tremendous opportunity to support broader decarbonization, even while barriers persist, the standard introduces an implementation hierarchy to guide company action. The hierarchy can be thought of as beginning as close to the emission source as possible and progressing away from the actual source when traceability, influence, or other constraints arise. Companies begin at the top of the hierarchy at the activity level, pursuing any and all actions that directly target emission sources where those reductions would be reflected in the physical inventory. When a company has taken all feasible actions at the activity level, and it's worth noting that kind of that feasibility is defined in the standard, but could be subject to additional guidance, they can then proceed to take action at the level of the activity pool. Activity pools are defined as a shared system that companies source from or feed into. You can see some of the examples on the right-hand side of the screen. But these are things like electricity grids, supply sheds, and logistics networks. In some situations, structural constraints may limit action at the activity or activity pool level. These constraints may include limitations in available technology and infrastructure, supporting regulation, or existing markets. In such cases, action may occur at what we're calling the sector level. In other words, this is outside of a defined activity pool, but within a relevant market or geography. And we'll get into some examples shortly to help put this all in context. Lastly, when sufficient decarbonization cannot be achieved within the target timeframe, companies are encouraged to take enabling actions. These contribute to overall systems transformation to enable future decarbonization. These actions do not necessarily count towards target implementation, but enhance credibility as a company progresses towards net zero. Now, at the end of each cycle, companies are required to conduct and submit a robust end of cycle assessment to assess target progress. Minimum progress criteria for companies seeking to set new targets following their first cycle under version 2 will be set out in a forthcoming resource, which we have named the SBTi Assurance Manual. You will see this reference throughout the standard as it is a component of ongoing work. We'll see momentarily, the SBTi is continuing to develop guidance and resources related to target implementation, assessing target progress, and renewing targets. Now that we've covered some of the key changes at a high level, let's discuss how to apply the standards using some examples to follow along. This is kind of exciting because I've actually never presented these slides. They have been sitting in a slide deck for me for a while. So if you're joining here today, this is a bit of an exclusive peek at some of the resources we've developed. So feel free to give me some feedback on what you think. But I think it's so helpful to put things into a bit of an example. All right, so let's look at two companies. So one we've defined as category A, the other as category B. Let's look at how they might navigate setting and implementing targets with version 2. Please note, very importantly, okay, these are entirely fictitious and any resemblance to real companies is absolutely unintentional. And if absolutely needed, please direct your legal officers to the footnote saying as much in case you do recognize yourself in either one of these companies, okay? Our first company is a large consumer packaged goods company based in Canada. The second company is a mid-sized biotechnology company based in China. All right, let's look at how they go through their target setting process. So as you might expect, our large consumer packaged goods company selects a mix of target setting types in scopes 1 and 3 to reflect the diverse activities both within the company's own operations and within their expansive value chain. In scope 1, they chose to set a new asset transition target for the few large manufacturing facilities that they actually own and operate. For all other scope 1 emissions, they set an absolute emissions reduction target as they do not meet the threshold for sector-specific approaches. In scope 2, they opt to set a low carbon electricity alignment target, as they've already been on a journey of steadily increasing the amount of low carbon electricity used, procured, or matched through the use of market instruments. In scope 3, also maybe unsurprising, they opted to set targets at the category and activity level. So again, there were 3 overall approaches in scope 3. 1, to set an overarching absolute emission reduction target. 2, to set an overarching supplier or customer alignment target. And 3, this is what they've opted for, to set targets at the category and activity level. Those will then be kind of aggregated into a headline ambition for scope 3, but they are kind of a portfolio of separate targets. So they decided to set a volume alignment target for category 1 to target purchased commodities such as aluminum and plastics used for packaging. For the remainder of category 1 and transport-related emissions, both upstream and downstream, so these are categories 4 and 9, they set an absolute emissions reduction target. Lastly, they set a product end-of-life alignment target for category 12 emissions. They have been steadily investing in circular solutions for their packaging and products. Our category B company, we're calling them Medical Labs Inc., chooses an absolute emissions reduction target for scope 1. They're really focusing on improving their process efficiency and electrifying some of their assets and processes, as they anticipate significant electricity consumption growth due to an expectation that the company continues to grow in the near term. They are actually required to set an emissions reduction target. For this target cycle, they opt out of setting a scope 3 target while they pursue better data. So that's just an important note that we did not cover, but category B companies, scope 3 targets are optional while they are required for category A companies. Great. Now, let's follow this journey into implementation. As you can see, each company takes actions across all scopes following the implementation hierarchy. To address scope one, our consumer packaged goods company, Meat and Clean Co., first focuses on electrifying assets where feasible. Then they purchase biomethane certificates. Importantly, these are injected into the same gas grid, so they meet the definition of an activity pool to match 2% of emissions from on-site combustion. To address scope two, they first invest in a direct line supply from a new offsite low carbon generation project for their largest facility. They also then sign a PPA for additional low carbon electricity, meeting some of the guardrails included in the standard. In scope three, they take a multi-pronged approach at the activity level, redesigning their largest volume products to reduce weight in transportation, while sourcing lower emissions input materials and redesigning packaging to reduce total material use. At the activity pool level, again, shared systems that companies source from or feed into, they purchase sustainable fuel certificates. These are matched to the fuel type used on their primary shipping route within the same logistics network that they use. Next, they purchase low carbon aluminum certificates for packaging, where the global commodity market makes direct sourcing of low carbon material structurally unavailable for them. Now let's look at our category B company, Medical Labs. They reduce absolute emissions in scope one, 3% year over year through process efficiencies and an additional 5% by retrofitting high emitting assets. So they do not need to pursue additional action outside of the activity level. In scope two, they first reduce electricity consumption through process efficiency and smart controls. Then they purchase eligible energy attribute certificates in their deliverability region. However, due to limited availability in their specific deliverability region, they also buy EACs from an adjacent but disconnected grid, and in parallel, engage in local advocacy to develop the low carbon electricity market in hopes that eventually they can procure more energy attribute certificates from their own deliverability region. Finally, I'll talk about what's coming next before Natalia takes over, discussing active target implications. Now that the standard is live, one of the most common questions is, when is it mandatory to use? As you can see here, the transition to the new standard will be gradual. Target validations will open in February 2027, giving companies interested in setting targets with version 2 plenty of time to prepare. Throughout 2027, companies will be able to choose between using V1 or V2 to set targets. Beginning February 1st, 2028, previous versions of the standard, including our separate near-term criteria, will no longer be eligible for use. One very important note here, and I think Natalia will get into this a bit more, is that existing validated targets remain valid. Companies do not need to transition to version 2 right away. However, companies looking to utilize some of the elements of version 2 with a version 1 target will be able to do so. And we'll get into some of that ongoing work on the next slide, but as you can see here, the SBTi will continue to work on additional guidance and resources throughout the remainder of this year and into 2027 to support companies setting targets. Lastly, before I hand it over, it's really important to underscore, like I've said now a couple of times, that the standard is part of really a broader system of normative documents. These will be finalized and released on a phased basis. So first, of course, the published standard available today, we hope provides stakeholders with the requirements and kind of the requirements at a minimum, right? Enabling companies to learn about updated criteria and assess implications on current or future targets. For companies that already have validated targets, like I said, some of the innovations within the standard will be available and applicable to leverage. For example, the target implementation hierarchy we just walked through will be open for all companies with validated targets. That will be outlined in the second resource indicated here, the renewal policy. But before that, you can see we have other resources planned for Q4 of this year and early 2027. As you can see, we have an asterisk beside that anticipated timing, knowing that projects and timelines are always subject to change when working in a multi-stakeholder environment and working on such tremendous standards. So first, interim accounting and reporting guidance. We know that a lot of companies want additional guidance while greenhouse gas protocol standards are under evolution and development. So we are hoping to publish some interim guidance so companies can feel more confident in their use of actions and market instruments. Next, that renewal policy, again, this will outline in more detail how companies with validated targets under version 1 can use some of the elements introduced in version 2 to apply to their targets today. Next, the SBTi is continuing work on the assurance framework. This will underlie all SBTi standards. So the assurance framework seeks to provide clarity on how conformance to the standards criteria will be assessed and validated. It will also outline the process and criteria for that end of cycle assessment. Next, the SBTi plans to publish a claims policy. This will provide guidance on how companies can make credible claims throughout the target cycle and in relation to target progress. Lastly, we know that it's a complex landscape of certificates and market instruments, so we would like to develop additional guidance on the use of these tools supported by an interoperability and recognition framework. This framework would be intended to establish basic criteria and processes for recognizing existing certification systems and instruments that meet SBTi criteria across the main categories of instruments used in target implementation. So these are things like energy certificates, industrial and agricultural commodity certificates, and carbon credits. This work will build on existing frameworks where available, aiming for interoperability across standards and a seamless target implementation journey for companies. With that, I will wrap and hand it over to the Agendi team.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kyra. I really appreciate you walking us through those exclusive examples. When I saw those for the first time, it really helped me visualize what it would look like to set targets under v2.0. So thank you for sharing those live today. So I'll spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about target implications. So Kyra just went through and talked about all the nuances about the v2.0 updates. And so I'll be talking a little bit about how these changes affect companies that are approaching different target milestones within their journeys already. So again, for those of you who were at the April webinar with us, these milestones will look familiar. We're going to focus today on how to specifically approach this transition period between v1.3.1 and v2.0. Great. So there are 4 common milestones that we see that companies may be approaching within their target setting journey. The first is first-time target submission. Maybe you've committed, maybe you're planning to commit or planning just to set a target outright. This is where you would fall. The second is base year and target recalculations. Third is the 5-year review process. And then fourth is subsequent targets. Cool. So first-time target submissions are for companies who are considering setting science-based targets and or have active commitments with the SBTi already. I will note that SBTi officially recommends not waiting and pursuing validation under the current standard as soon as possible. For companies that already have a commitment in place, this is where we're going to get into, maybe apologies in advance, we're going to be getting into a lot of different dates. So please let me know in the questions if something wasn't clear, but I'll try to be as clearly communicating these as possible. So at a high level, if you already have a commitment and the commitment deadline is prior to January 31st, 2027, so coming up in the next 6-ish months, you would need to use v1.3.1. given v2.0 won't be available until February 1st, 2027. However, if you hope to adopt V2, you can reach out to SBTi services to request an extension. And then if that's granted, then you would be able to submit under v2.0 at a later date. If your commitment deadline falls between February 1st and January 2027, and then January 31st, 2028, you have the option to use either version, either V1 or V2. But if your commitment deadline is after the 31st of January, 2028, you would be required to use version 2 if submitting targets from February 1st onwards. So this is reiterating what Kyra just walked through in the timeline, and I will be doing that again and again in different specific subtexts, but it should all align. For companies without previous current commitments or targets, so maybe you're thinking about setting a target or thinking about committing more specifically, you can optionally commit in the portal itself. For these companies, you would still have the option to commit separately to near-term and net zero targets through V1 through January 31st, 2027, as is shown here. Of course, like being mindful of the dates you're actually submitting the target. But if you commit from February 1st, 2027 onward, you will only be allowed to use V2.0 to fulfill your commitment. So I'll rephrase this because this was a little confusing for me when I first saw this. What this means is even though V2 is only required from February 1st, 2028 onward, it would be the only standard you can commit to once V2.0 is live. And again, commitment is optional here. Okay. For the next milestone is base year and target recalculations, and these affect companies that have experienced a significant change that could maybe compromise the existing targets. And generally, those significant changes need to meet the 5% or more change in base year emissions relative to those scopes covered by the target. Examples of triggers under V1.3.1 would be mergers and acquisitions, methodology and data changes, consolidation approach shifts, emission allocation shifts, etc. So if you've approached one of these, you may already be thinking about this. Then companies would follow this process of rebaselining, remapping your target over the updated base year, and then figuring out whether the ambition and coverage remain in line with the SBTi criteria. And finally, if needed, resubmit the target. So under V1.3.1 specifically, I'll go through details for this and also for V2. There are additional details of the specific rebaselining triggers that can be found in the criteria assessment indicators. I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you are interested, go to see, criteria 27 under the near term and then net zero criteria 33. That will give you all the details you need. But maybe more importantly, I think this is going to answer some questions that I've been receiving a lot lately, and maybe Kyra has as well. If you need to rebaseline, and it occurs separate from your 5-year mandatory review process. So in the middle of your target cycle, you have a merger, you need to rebaseline. The updated transition guidance that SBTi has published indicates that companies only have to assess if their targets remain compliant with the criteria under which they were originally assessed. So what this means, to be super clear, is if you set targets through V1.3 and you have a rebaseline, you would assess whether it's still valid under V1.3, right? Then only if it's not, right? Maybe it doesn't meet the coverage requirements or the emission requirements anymore, then only then you would be required to submit an updated target. And you may need to align with V2.0. This is if the revalidation occurs after that February 1st, 2028 date, where V2.0 is mandatory. So rebaselining in and of itself doesn't mean you need to transition to the new standard, but if you do need to revalidate your targets for any reason and it happens to be after February 1st, 2028, then you would need to transition to V2.0. Hopefully that clarifies some questions. Okay. Same thing, but for V2.0. There are additional trigger criteria that can be found in the C criteria 8 and 20 of the standard itself, as well as this preliminary minimum evidence document, which I will say is preliminary and is still subject to change. However, under V2.0, there has been a distinction made between the different types of triggers. Largely, they're similar, right? Still mergers, acquisitions, investments, methodology changes, things like that. However, there are two different timings for the triggers. So one is during ongoing evaluation. So this is before your target year. For V2.0, the target year is always 5 years after, for near-term targets, 5 years after um, the submission. So within your target year means before 5 years. The triggers that are applicable for ongoing evaluation include things that are more likely to affect the target validity. So think things like changes in your organizational operational boundaries, like mergers, acquisitions, divestments, changes in your consolidation approach, in the company activities that cause emissions, or maybe might cause it to shift scopes across different scopes or categories. These would need to be addressed within the target cycle during ongoing evaluation. There are separate triggers that are considered at the end of the cycle. So Kyra mentioned there's this end of cycle assessment period at the end of the 5 years. And at this time is when triggers like changes in methodologies used, changes in data quality or data quality improvements, or even data or calculation errors would be considered only at the end of that end of cycle assessment. So similar triggers, potentially different timing. And then last but not least, for category A companies, which is likely most folks on this call, if you do need to go through target revalidation, SBTi would require third-party assurance for the recalculated greenhouse gas emissions and other metrics for the new updated base year. So assurance is already a requirement for category A companies on the base year. So this is just a continuation of that requirement for the updated new base year. Great. Okay. 5-year review process. Companies that are approaching their 5-year review period, this occurs at the end of the month, 5 years after the initial validation. The transition guidance clarifies that targets should be aligned with the acceptable criteria at the time of the review submission. So in contrast to what I've just said, this means that if your trigger date is coming up between now and December 2027, you have the option to use either V1 or V2, of course, being mindful again of the dates in italics. But if your trigger date is January 31st or later, then you would be required to use 2.0. If you are finding yourself in a position where your trigger date might be on or after 31st of January of 2028, SBTi has stated that there is in their transition guidance that companies can potentially bypass that 5-year review process by submitting a complete scope 1, 2, and 3 update prior to that trigger date, and it essentially resets that clock. Again, it has to be the complete target. Last thing to note here about 5-year reviews is that if you do set a near-term target in alignment with V2, targets do not undergo this process because targets are 5 years. Instead, they go through that updated end of cycle assessment where you would have to submit detailed information about the target process, and then that is formally assessed by SBTi. Okay, quick example to make sure it's super clear. Let's take the case of a company that has a mandatory review in 2027. They went and got their first target validation in 2022. And in August, they actually ended up updating the ambition of their scope 1 target only, meaning the trigger date remains the same because scopes 2 and 3 are their oldest active targets. They then have that trigger of January 31st and have until July to review evidence, and it's due to SBTi services, under which they can use either V1 or V2. And then they have until 1 year after that trigger date to actually submit targets. Great. Okay. Lastly, if companies have reached or surpassed their target year, they have the option under V1.3.1 to set subsequent targets. This visual is just a duplicate of what Kyra had shared earlier and reiterating the same timeline for when V1 and V2 are applicable. If you do choose to set a target under V2, two important notes that I think Kyra has also already mentioned, but worth clarifying one more time. You're required to submit targets, subsequent targets, between 24 months before and 12 months after your target year. It's a continuous cycle. That's why it's called a target cycle. And then, as she mentioned as well, there is going to be minimum progress criteria for companies, but that is expected to be released in early next year. Okay. Quick key takeaways before we open it up for questions. If you leave here with just four things to remember, it should be that V2 builds on the already strong foundation of the original standard. It keeps a lot of the architecture intact, but actually expands optionality and has an increased focus on implementation and accountability, including introducing that clear hierarchy of decarbonization actions that Kyra walked us through. This one you might be tired of hearing, but V1.3.1 is valid through the 31st of January, 2028, after which it will be V.2.0 as a requirement. And then lastly, just be mindful of your active target milestones during the transition period. There's a lot of nuance in there, as we just talked about, and how your target is impacted may depend on the timing of the milestones that you reach. So I would recommend reading that transition guidance. Which brings us to next steps, building what I just said. We do encourage you to explore the relevant resources for V2.0, including that transition guidance, and we've linked the webpage here, and look out for additional material later this year and early next that supplement the standard. Secondly, we do intend to host a mini series of SBTi related content on specific topics where we'll get to dive into a little bit more detail on topics like decarbonization and transition planning, market mechanisms, scope 2 implications, and actually a transportation specific decarbonization deep dive. But in the meantime, of course, feel free to reach out to Helena or myself if you have questions or need support in thinking through target setting or decarbonization strategies. Great. Okay, so I already see a lot of questions coming through. So maybe this is the perfect time to pause and open up for questions. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen as well so that everyone can see our faces. Great. So keep putting in your questions. I see a lot of anonymous ones, so I do encourage you to put your names in because we likely won't have time to cover everything. And if it's anonymous, we won't know who to reach out to. So please, if you have already submitted, resubmit your question with your name. Okay, let's start. So maybe a question for you, Kyra, to start off. How will SBTi be able to identify that the company is doing best efforts? How will SBTi distinguish credible best efforts implementation from insufficient progress at the end of cycle assessment?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. So yes, as we saw kind of in some of the previous slides, there is still some ongoing work from the SBTi to support the standard that's underway. So the best efforts basis, just to kind of refresh, clarify for folks that maybe are less familiar, this is essentially something that we've identified as a need through our strategy and through talking with a tremendous number of stakeholders here, right? So targets are set on this best effort basis, and meaning that a company has demonstrated a level of effort to implement all available actions within their control or influence that are necessary and appropriate to implement targets. Okay, so this would include the identification, reporting, and active management of material dependencies and associated risks. But in the case that a company perhaps does not fully achieve their target due to some of these structural constraints, barriers, perhaps the systems that they were anticipating would be available were not. If they can demonstrate really this best effort, so credible, robust action, they would be permitted to continue on to set targets for their next target cycle. Important to note, the ambition would be reflective of that kind of delta between the target, what the target was hoping to achieve and where the company is at. So it's not saying that your ambition decreases, but it's saying that you can continue on and set your next tranche of targets. So how kind of the mechanics of this, the criteria, et cetera, how this will function in practice will be outlined in a few different places. First was that renewal policy mentioned. So that's really how companies, kind of with version 1 targets can take advantage of some of these version 2 elements. And then I imagine some of this will also be further clarified and maybe expounded on in much greater detail in that SBTi assurance framework, which will really look at that end of cycle assessment more holistically.
Perfect. Yes, re-emphasizing, I guess, the fact that there's going to be updated materials coming in Q4 and early 2027 that will also put this into writing in more detail. So thanks for mentioning this. Okay. Next question is, for targets set for 2035 under the previous standard, which I'm assuming is V1.3, or sorry, V1.3, will they still be valid until the target year?
So for targets set for 2035, depending on when they were set, they may be subject to the mandatory 5-year review and or this end of cycle assessment previous to that target year. So again, kind of if they're subject to the mandatory 5-year review and they're found that the targets are no longer aligned with kind of the most recent criteria at the time of that review, they may need to pursue a target recalculation and revalidation. So again, this is if the revalidation is done after February 1st, 2028, then they would be required to align to version 2. If prior to February 1st, 2028, they could align their targets to version 1 or version 2.
Yes, and for whoever asked this question, also hopefully what I went through as far as the target milestones would be helpful for you to review as well, and I'm happy to have a conversation after that, after this session. Okay, have quite kind of a long question here related to SAF. So a quick plug on my side before I read the question is that I mentioned we're going to be doing kind of a series of additional webinars, and one of them is transportation focused. So I might invite to that session where we might cover some of this in more detail. But let me read the question. So SAF production is currently not ramping up at the pace expected by many net zero aviation scenarios, and SAF book and claim is often seen as a way to stimulate demand, support producers, accelerate deployment. How does 2.0 consider SAF and SAF book and claim mechanisms? Are they accepted for target achievement? And what validation, accounting, and verification requirements must organizations meet for SBTi recognition? Does SBTi view book and claim as an important mechanism? So lots of questions there.
Yeah, all good. No, this is a common question and super valid. So while not distinctly called out within the standard, version 2 does allow for the use of market instruments. So first, important across all scopes. Okay, so if you think back to that implementation hierarchy, you had companies taking action at that activity level, and then at the activity pool, sector level, et cetera. And that was across scopes 1, 2, and 3. So that's first kind of important to keep in mind. But those also include certificates that are based on mass balance or book and claim models. So different chain of custody models may inform and kind of underlie the certificate that is produced. As long as these meet kind of the safeguards that are A, built into the hierarchy, and B, the minimum integrity criteria established in the standard. We did not have time to get into that today, but we do have some more detailed guidance on kind of actions, market instruments, what integrity criteria we have set out in the standard, while we are continuing to develop additional guidance on reporting, accounting, and that interoperability and kind of third-party recognition framework. So further guidance on commodity certificates, energy attribute certificates, et cetera, will be forthcoming. Again, as you also potentially saw right now, to kind of maintain broad alignment while not really preempting some of the evolving work at Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we have maintained that companies will still report the physical inventory, and then actions and market instruments not reflected in the physical inventory. So this would be something like a market instrument based on book and claim would be reported separately to kind of maintain that transparency. But the last thing I'll say kind of on this question, or multiple questions, is that we actually have an open call for evidence right now on related to kind of heavy emitting industries, which includes our aviation sector standard. So the purpose that we can get into that a little bit, and I can send some follow-up to send through to webinar participants here. But we do kind of have an open call for evidence about potentially updating our aviation guidance as well to bring it more in line with version 2.
Which maybe is the most wonderful segue I could have asked for into this other question, which somebody asked, how do sector-specific standards fall within this timeline, and are they still relevant, or do companies need to wait for them to be updated as well? You
That was
have
a really
answered
great
it.
segue. Yeah, we really teed ourselves up well for that one. So
Yeah.
thank you to who asked the question on staff. So yeah, great question. So the SBTi, we're actually in the process of kicking off a ton of work and engagement on aligning our sector standards with version 2. So this was first outlined in May of this year. We published a refreshed strategy for the SBTi. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at the executive summary just to see what is SBTi planning to do really up until 2030, and where are we evolving and what are we updating, et cetera. So that's a great place to start. But beyond that, yes, it is a major priority for us in the coming months. We've kicked off a structured sector engagement work plan. So the first element of that work plan, which I just spoke to, is this open call for evidence. So a call for evidence is kind of an engagement process by which we invite anyone, the public, stakeholders, to submit research, to submit articles, to submit studies, et cetera, to the SBTi to help inform the evolution of our standards. So we did this in relation to EACs back in 2024, 2025. We did this in terms of kind of our relation to value chain emissions, et cetera. But really, this is like the first step for us in kind of the overall sector, excuse me, the overall standards update process to ensure that we are grounded in science and remaining aligned with like the most current research. So that is open now. And then we will additionally plan to have actual like consultations, engagements, convenings, et cetera, on sector standards. So again, bringing them in line with version 2, updating them to reflect kind of current science, the realities of the market, where we're at in terms of system transformation, et cetera. So definitely encourage you to kind of stay tuned on that. Definitely sign up for our newsletter to receive any information about our sector work program. And you can always check out, kind of open engagement opportunities on our webpage.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Kara. I mentioned this in the chat. We will not be able to get to all the questions, so last verbal plea to include your names in these questions so I can reach out to you after with answers, because there is at least 5 anonymous questions in there. We'll stop here. We never have enough time for questions, but note that Helena and myself have our door open. The Science-Based Targets team at Science-Based Targets have their doors open to answer questions. There's that opportunity to provide feedback on the was it MMV? Did I say that right, Kyra?
Yes, there the NMPs, the methods,
MMP,
metrics,
yes,
and
yes.
pathways document. There's a few different things, opportunities
Mm-hmm.
for feedback in, get involved at a later date. But of course, we're always interested in hearing if there are additional resources that you can't find and would be helpful.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you found this valuable. I appreciate all your questions. For those who do have their names listed and we weren't able to get your questions, I will be reaching out to you in the coming weeks with answers to those questions. So much appreciated and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank
Bye, everybody.
you.